All right, welcome to another edition of Bench Talk here from Empty the Bench. Tom Albano and Nick Fodera here, and joining us this week, well, we're going to be doing a little bit of hockey. I've said in our recent broadcast, we've been doing some sports that we haven't covered for a while, like mixed martial arts, and now we're going to be throwing in some NHL. So as the NHL restart is about to happen, we're joined by Sean Fitzgerald, senior national writer for The Athletic up in Canada. Sean, thank you so much for coming on to talk with us today.
No, we're going to be talking some Canadian Football League too, right, fellas? Is that the other sport that we're going to wade into today?
I wish.
Because they're talking about a hub city in Winnipeg, and I know you guys are all over that stuff. So we can talk Winnipeg local politics, anything you want. I'm happy to help out, boys.
Sounds
We're
good.
honorary Canadians just because we live in New York. That's the proximity rule.
You're a border state. I mean, you're not allowed over the border, but you're a border state, so that's good.
We share the balls.
Yeah. So I probably should kick things off by asking you, Sean, do you think that the NHL playoffs are going to be able to start on time, and do you think they'll be able to complete the 2014 playoffs without any kind of significant interruption?
The 2014 playoffs, I think, did go without.
The 2020 playoffs, I should say. Sorry.
Well, the 2014, yeah.
Yeah, 2014, that was a good year. I mean, that was interrupted. I mean, Canada won the Olympics in Sochi that year. Guys came back. They were energized. I mean, it was a great playoff. And it ended before August, too, notably. Yeah, it's an interesting question, fellas. Like right now, things in Canada, so for the Canadian markets, aside from the torrential rains that swamped Rogers Place in Edmonton last night, and you saw the videos online of sort of a swimming pool in the ground floor. It's been sort of a return to business. But I can tell you from a Canadian perspective, there is concern when we watch the news of what's going on south. And, the teams that are practicing right now in those hotspots. And you're looking at Florida, you're looking at Texas, you're looking especially at the South and the West. And you're wondering, like, okay, it's, we're less than 2 weeks out from the bubble, is everybody going to be able to, avoid this pandemic and stay healthy to get to the bubble in the first place? And then, I mean, I'm happy to get into all the complications of life in the bubble as well. But I think right now, the first concern is, can you get everybody to the bubble safely?
And on that note, when everybody does get to the bubble, is it reasonable to expect that we'll see a few players, well, more than a few, test positive for COVID? And you hope that these teams have a contingency plan in place.
Yeah, no, I mean, for sure. I've been watching kind of closely Major League Soccer and their MLS is Back tournament in Orlando. I mean, they lost a couple teams because of, rampant virus, basically. The Toronto FC had a game on Sunday morning scheduled for 9 a.m., which is just prime soccer time, I guess, against DC United. And it was postponed because a DC United player returned a positive test for COVID. Now, that game was scheduled successfully for the following morning, and MLS has since trumpeted, I think, 2 or 3 days without a positive test. So, even in Florida, 3 days in, they're showing some success with this bubble. But again, not without hiccups getting to that point. So, if you had, say, the Columbus Blue Jackets, report to the bubble, and just before the games were supposed to start, they report 6 players with positive tests or 3 players. It's not as easy in a condensed schedule when you have these, best of 5 series to say, okay, we're going to put this off for 2 or 3 days, because it really starts backing things up. So, when you look at it that way, and you look at some of the games that have already started, some of the leagues that have already returned, it doesn't take a lot to convince yourself that it won't take much to overturn the whole apple cart.
So, drawing on your own, expertise, I need to ask, in your opinion, how does the NHL's testing protocol stack up against that of the MLB, that of the NBA? And in your opinion, are there places in which the testing protocol could or should improve?
Well, I mean, we'll find out, right? Right now, everybody's in their own market. It doesn't matter. I've talked to infectious diseases experts out the wazoo up here. And it's different here, knock on wood, than it is in the United States right now. But, a lot of them are saying that at a certain point, if the virus is so pervasive in a market, it becomes almost impossible to create anything approaching a safe bubble. So, if you are a team that's practicing or based in the United States in one of those, I guess we can call them hot zones, how do you possibly keep people safe? Because, these guys are driving to and from the rink. Maybe they got to pick up a loaf of bread on the way home, or maybe they go out and get a sandwich. Like, when the numbers are that high, how do you keep them safe? And it doesn't matter what the testing protocol is if you can't get them here in the first place.
And we have seen, going back to the idea of the bubble, we have seen the difficulties and concerns that the NBA is currently having with the Orlando bubble and its players. What do you see from how the NBA is handling its restart that you think the NHL needs to avoid in order to keep the resumption of play, going without interruption?
Yeah, I think what we've seen in the NBA, honestly, is just, humanity. Like, a player who violated the quarantine already because they went across the line at Disney World to get like takeout, like food delivery, right? Like honestly, so we're sitting here. I've got two small kids, fellas. Like I've got a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old. So if you said, hey, Sean, you want to go spend a few weeks or maybe a couple months in a quiet hotel room by yourself, I'd be like, hell yes. But you know what? Like even after that, even after escaping the prison riot that lives in my living room, for the last 128 days, at a certain point, like even if you're with in a bed with a thread count of 1,000, it still does get boring. Like you're gonna want to go in the Shoppers Drug Mart or your local pharmacy and get a toothbrush, or feel like just going for a walk outside the campus, but you're not going to be able to because it'll compromise the safety of the whole thing. So I mean, the Raptors, the Toronto Raptors, the defending NBA champions, are planning and being in Orlando for quite some time, and their assistant general manager has spoken openly of they have lots of doctors and medical people, but they also have a lot of people there to help with the mental health aspect of this. And that, you're going to be away from the people you love. You're going to be, with your teammates in a hotel, unable to move freely for potentially a long time. And that's going to be a huge challenge. And it's easy for us on the outside of the bubble to say, oh, these guys are spoiled, coddled athletes and blah, 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 blah. But like at the end of the day, would you want to, no matter how nice the hotel, would you want to spend 3 months there in a room by yourself and going from the room to the rink and back and forth with some meals and maybe a trip to the rooftop pool in between?
So, Sean, I mean, in terms of sports coverage down here, we haven't really heard much about any kind of problems that the NHL has been running into, or even you could probably count on one hand the people who know that the NHL is actually starting up again. And that's not an indictment on you or your work. That's more about here. Why do you think that no one here is talking about the NHL getting resuming play?
That is a loaded question to ask a Canadian about what's going on in the United States.
I know. Right? I don't mean to hurt your feelings.
Well, as compared to say like the MLB season almost didn't happen because of CBA issues, and the NBA, the players like Kyrie who ended up having concerns about going to the bubble last minute.
Look, fellas, there's a couple of things. One, like I read the news this morning. Apparently, there's a pandemic, and it's like a thing, right? And it's not just in Canada, but it's also apparently in the United States, and it's in the UK and Europe even. So it's everywhere except New Zealand. So that's one thing. So it's tough to really focus on anything, sports or otherwise, when there's so much pandemic coverage. I'm also told, hold on, sources are telling me it might be an election year in the United States. So again, like you're taking up so much oxygen, there's only so much left, even in a world where we're so obsessed with sports. All that being said as well, is that we're used to, I want to say this delicately and with all due respect, but when you look at things being run smoothly, when you look at things being a model, especially with the big four North American sports, all due respect to, Major League Soccer as well, that you look at the NFL as saying, look, those guys can make money by blinking. You look at the NBA and say, wow, look at how they've globalized the game, and look how well they market their stars and free them to sort of show their personalities. And you look at baseball and baseball advanced media and all the money they've made. You don't look at the NHL and saying, there's the model of consistency that you want to see. But in this case, I think what the NHL has done, I don't know if I want to say it's by design, that by holding off as long as it did in naming those two hub cities, it didn't lock into Florida, even though Florida was open for business when the testing was low. It didn't lock into Nevada, even when the the mayor of Las Vegas, 36 seconds after the lockdown, said, hey, it's time to open the casinos, and was willing to bring the whole world to Las Vegas. What they did by waiting was they were able to pick two of the spots that made the most sense health-wise. Edmonton is in Alberta, which again saw, it's seen a bit of a tick, but up here, a tick right now, again, knocking on wood, is going up to 150 cases a day. Ontario, I think today was 111. So, by going up there and just quietly putting the two hubs in Canada and, knock on wood for the health of everybody involved, nothing has really gone sideways for the NHL. So the NHL, to this point, hasn't been newsworthy enough to inject itself in any conversation because the other leagues are all wrestling with their own meta issues.
Talking to Sean Fitzgerald with The Athletic. Sean, the NHL officially announced the return to play protocol at the end of May, but they noted that everything couldn't be official until there was the clearances from the government to make sure that COVID-19 was under control. It took us until, it's going to be August 1st to get us to resume play. Was the NHL's decision to come out with that plan in mid to late May the right thing to do in terms of logic and giving the people some needed positivity? Was it a big risk if they had not been able to follow through with the plan?
I mean, that's the thing is that, you couldn't have predicted. I mean, Florida wasn't Florida back then. Texas wasn't Texas. Arizona, the epicenter was, at that point in the United States, fairly localized in New York. What the NHL did was it, again, put its foot forward and said, look, here's our plan. And by leaving the deadlines fluid, I think what they did was really smart of saying, you know what? Nobody knows what this thing's doing. It's like having a newborn kid, right? Like you have a kid, you're going to have a different kid every 6 weeks. Like the kid at, straight out of the oven's one thing, the kid 6 weeks later is another thing. And after 18 weeks, you're like, holy crap, who'd this guy come from? Like it changes all the time. And that's what we're seeing with COVID-19 and this novel coronavirus, that it has a real strong knack for undoing the best of human intentions. So by giving themselves this much time, the NHL was able to say, look, we'd like to have small group training on by the start of July. We'd like to have training camp going by this day. And ideally, we'd like to be back on the ice here at a location to be named later. So by giving themselves that flexibility, they're able to monitor the developments, which happen at lightning speed, and try and make the best decisions. And look, guys, Ontario is moving into phase 3 of its reopening plan as we speak. And as soon as next week, it's possible that people in Toronto might be allowed inside bars and movie theaters again. And it's possible that, a couple weeks after that, when guys are supposed to be in Toronto playing hockey, that we could see our numbers go through the roof and this whole thing could be undone. There's nothing that's certain about any of this. Let's be clear. But by giving themselves the flexibility, I think the NHL played this right.
So, Sean, I need to ask, in your best estimation, do you think that the 4-month layoff could have an adverse effect on team momentum and chemistry?
Well, I mean, you have to go back almost and read the archives about who's on which team at this point. It's been a full off season. The Toronto Maple Leafs might have somebody named Nick Robertson on their forward unit. And who's Nick Robertson? He's a second-round draft pick, big deal. But, he had a really good run with the Peterborough Petes. And he scored 55 goals in 30-something games, and all he's been doing in those 4 months is adding bulk to the point where I'm going to try to approximate this, but his neck looks like this now. He doesn't look like an 18-year-old kid. He looks like a dude who has aged and put on quite a bit of muscle. So that was a resource that wouldn't have been available to the Leafs 4 months ago. He might well be available to them when the games start. And there will be players and stories like that all across the spectrum. So, I mean, when you're looking at who's going to have an advantage, it's almost an entirely new season. It is a new season. I mean, it's been a full off season.
And on that note, would you make the argument that it's fair?
I'd never argue with you fellas. I'd never argue with you guys. I'm Canadian. I'm way too polite. I'm not like you New York guys.
For all intents and purposes.
Okay, yeah, I'll pretend.
Would you be for or against this whole argument that we're seeing in the restarted and shortened leagues of an asterisk on the champions of the whole thing?
No, if you win it, you win it. I mean, it's going to be, it's going to be different. But the thing is that, the last time the Leafs won the Stanley Cup, you didn't have to go 4 rounds. Like, so they get an asterisk then retroactively because they didn't have to go 4 rounds. No, this is going to have its own set of challenges. You're going to have your video team breaking down film of teams that might be entirely new. Everybody who had injuries, guess what? Chances are they're going to be healthy. On the flip side, those old cliches that, you usually see us trot out in September when training camp, that if you don't get a full camp or you don't follow that regular rhythm, look out, because that means that, statistically you're going to be due for more injuries when the season starts. So your timing might be off. So, you throw all these factors into a really condensed schedule where you're going to be playing playoff games back to back in that first round. No, it's whoever wins this, whoever emerges, on top of also avoiding COVID-19. No, you don't get an asterisk. You get the cup, and you get to disinfect it thoroughly before you drink out of it.
So considering the damage, you had mentioned this before, suffered by the Edmonton Oilers arena recently, you think the NHL might need to be reconsidering its Western hub city?
Considering that's why I have the question mark in the graphic.
No, I mean, there's nowhere else that'd have them. Like they're at a run room. Like there's a Canadian hero up here. Her name is Dr. Bonnie Henry, and she's the chief medical officer in our westernmost province, British Columbia, which is also home to the Vancouver Canucks. And she and her office is one of the reasons that Edmonton and Toronto are the hub cities instead of Vancouver. They didn't like the NHL's bubble plan necessarily. There was something that broke down. And the really remarkable thing is that if you went and checked and you went and you asked, nobody in Vancouver is upset, because at this point they're like, well, if Dr. Bonnie Henry doesn't like it, then neither do we. So you start breaking it down and you look through the cities that were on that top 10 list. There are only 2 other Canadian cities on that list. So if something really bad happened to Rogers Centre last night, the NHL would have been in real trouble. But all reports were that the ground floor, the lobby, because of that torrential rain that Edmonton had last night, it was swamped. But apparently, based on reports, I'm not in Edmonton, but based on reports, structurally it's sound, the ice plant's fine, and it should be ready to go for next month.
And speaking of the hub cities, the NHL, of course, ended up going with the 2 Canadian hub cities, Edmonton and Toronto. There were rumors, and there was a heavy favorite in Las Vegas. Mm-hmm. So we could have 1 American city, 1 Canadian city. Of course, I had heard that apparently having the 2 Canadian hubs kind of makes it a little cheaper for the NHL, but there were some hopes that to have 1 American and 1 Canadian. How do you think the NHL feels about having both of its hub cities in Canada?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, the tax situation will be interesting because, money generated, you have to pay local taxes in Ontario and Alberta. But at the same time, the Canadian dollar is trading. I haven't checked the money markets yet this morning, but, in the mid 70s range. So say 75, 76, even if it's up to 80 cents on the US dollar, that's a lot cheaper than having to, pay full freight in, one of those US hub cities. So they're saving money there. NBC is bringing its crews into Canada to create that universal feed, which it would for, say, an Olympics. So, everything the NHL would need is there. And it's not like, any U.S. teams are going to be deprived of a home ice advantage, because even the Oilers and Leafs aren't going to have a home ice advantage. There's going to be nobody in the stands. All it is the 2 things that they needed the most. Somebody who was willing to take them and absorb the risk, and somebody who, again, knock on wood at the moment, doesn't have daily record rates of infection of COVID-19.
So, Sean, I needed to ask this question because this just mystified me. So, in terms of the new NHL Draft Lottery structure, this labyrinthine structure that doesn't make any sense, especially including the quote-unquote mystery playoff team, why did they decide to do this? Keep in mind, of course, we root for 2 teams that have been absurdly lucky in the draft the past couple of years. Seeing as how
we're both Oilers?
No, we're both Ranger fans.
No, I know. No, I think the Oilers still have a chance to win this one, so that's a really interesting thing. No, I mean, like, I've read about it, fellas. I wish I could say here, and with my hand over my heart, that I fully and truly understand the rationale and the reasoning behind this. I understand why they held it when they did, because if you're a hockey fan in Ottawa, that's a long time to go without anything to talk about. So I think holding it when the league did, trying again to piggyback off the idea of what the NFL did with its draft, that, you know, popping out of the blue is sort of this savior of sports content in the middle of a global pandemic, that it gave the teams that have nothing something to talk about. As it stands for the mystery team getting it, you know what, that carries the interest into the first round. If there's a team on the ropes, that's something else to talk about. And it gives, again, you guys were talking about why nobody's talking about this in the United States. This gives people another excuse to talk about hockey potentially.
And one last thing here, Sean, just going back to what we were saying before we ended up going on the air, talking about how we're starting in August with this playoffs, and depending how long it could go. I mean, usually the NHL season kicks off in October. How much do you think the 2020-2021 NHL season is going to be delayed by? When are we going to get that started? Is it going to be a shortened season? What do you see for that?
Well, I mean, the NHL has been, I mean, Bill Daly's been pretty adamant that they're not going to have a shortened season, but I mean, I don't see how you possibly do that. And the other thing is too, I mean, talking about the teams that aren't in this, 24-team jamboree, that's what you're looking at, a minimum of potentially 8 months between games, like maybe a year. I mean, that's a really interesting challenge for those fan bases. I mean, some of those teams are so terrible. I bet you some of those fans don't miss watching hockey, but it is an interesting situation all around. And, I'd be curious to know how long that offseason is going to end up being.
So a lot to look forward to in terms of the uncertainty of the upcoming future of the NHL and just all the playoff action. And it's going to have some hockey back. So, Sean, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us, taking some time out of your day.
Thank you so much for having me, fellas.